Welcome back to the David Kurten Show on today's News Talk TNT. It is really good to have George Szamuely with me in the show today. Welcome, George, to the show.
Good to be with you, David.
It's really good to see you. I met you on a podcast that Gonzalo Lira was doing.
That's right.
It was about a
Exactly.
year ago. Yeah,
That's right.
that's where we
Yeah.
we saw each other first of all. It was
That's right.
really good to do that, and it's I feel so awful about what's happened to Gonzalo. Earlier this year he was killed in a prison in Ukraine, and the situation there is terrible, and it goes on. But you comment about that a lot. You've got an incredible CV. You are a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. You are a co-host of the Gaggle. But what do you make of what's happening in Ukraine now? Because I would have thought that people would have seen common sense and just tried to end this and tried to find an off ramp, but it seems to just go on and on and on. What do you make of what's going on, and where do you think it's going?
Well, as you say, common sense would surely dictate that this war be brought to an end as soon as possible. That isn't really NATO's objective, and NATO is absolutely determined not to lose in Ukraine. That's very dangerous because
Mm,
essentially whatever happens, they are going to escalate their involvement because they cannot face the prospect of a defeat. Because if NATO, as NATO sees it, if NATO loses in Ukraine, then essentially it will be the defeat of the post-Cold War era and
mm,
a rewriting of the Cold War, because suddenly it won't be the West that has won the Cold War and the Soviet Union lost, but maybe the West hasn't won the Cold War. So there are a lot
mm,
of at stake in this conflict, and therefore it becomes very dangerous. And I do think that NATO will step by step uh, seriously escalate its involvement,
mm.
down to and possibly getting into some kind of a shooting war with Russia.
But how did this happen? Because I remember 20 years ago, there seemed to be some kind of entente being created, entente cordiale between the West and Russia. The G7 became the G8. Putin came to some of the G8 conferences. He was welcomed by Tony Blair and George Bush back at the time, and then it all suddenly seems to have just gone totally wrong. I mean, how did that happen?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think it's that NATO embarked on a policy of defining itself in opposition to Russia. I think Putin has said many times that he had offered to join NATO back in 2000, and I think he did it several times since then. And that would have made sense in that he's saying, well, NATO would then become an extension of the OSCE, and it would be a
Hmm.
kind of a security framework in which everybody is secure, everybody guarantees everybody else's borders, and no one can enhance his own security at the expense of somebody else's security. But NATO really didn't want that. NATO rejected it, and therefore, essentially, it defined itself in opposition to the one state that was excluded from NATO, and therefore NATO began its expansion and surrounding Russia with hostile states, essentially states that were members of a hostile military alliance. Well, sooner or later, Russia was going to say that this is unacceptable because you're basically turning us into a dependency because we can't really do anything if we're surrounded by a hostile state. So Russia was going to try and break out. So I would say that when historians come to write this era, they will say that this conflict was provoked by NATO's insistence on continued expansion and the attack on Russia's
Hmm.
security.
I mean, do you think the leaders of NATO are they stupid, or have they got some goal in mind? I mean, you hear that there are certain reports, and some people have the idea they actually want to effect regime change in Russia. and get rid of Putin, take over Russia and turn it into a series of smaller statelets that they can then control, like they control Eastern Europe. I mean, uh, is there any basis in fact for that?
I think so. I think that is the goal. I think they're hoping to remove Putin, and this has really been, if one looks back at this, well, why did they push Ukraine? Why, they knew they had all the warnings that Ukraine was a red line for Russia. Why did they go on pushing? Why did they continue to
Mm,
incorporate Ukraine into NATO? Well, NATO felt that it's a win-win for them because either
mm,
they succeed and Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, and therefore Russia really is in a bind because its entire western border will be NATO land, or Russia does something about it, and and as it did,
mm,
uses armed force. Well, that puts Russia into a very tricky position, and when once there's a war, who knows how any war ends up. So that becomes a serious problem, and I
mm,
think NATO envisages itself as a global military alliance. I don't think they're not going to stop here in Europe. They want to move on into Central Asia and then
mm,
into the Far East, and then they want to ultimately incorporate the Pacific Rim as well. And they want to bring in Australia. They want to bring in Japan, South Korea, and in fact, this was former NATO Supreme Allied Commander James Stavridis wrote this in a Bloomberg column, I think about yesterday. Yeah,
mm,
NATO should expand in order to bring in Australia, South Korea, and Singapore. That's the ambition. And so within this ambition, obviously they would like to see Russia disintegrate, Russia, lose,
mm.
collapse, and to finish off the job that they didn't finish off in the 90s. I mean, it was a dream come true what was happening in the 90s in Russia.
Mm.
Now they would like to see to go back to that and to finish the job off, so not to allow yet another Putin to emerge in 20 years' time.
Yeah, well, it doesn't seem like it's going very well for them, though, actually, because whatever they throw at Putin and the Russian forces in eastern and southern Ukraine, they've escalated from armored vehicles to HIMARS systems to Storm Shadow rockets to Leopard tanks, and now they're talking about actual fighter jets and actually putting NATO troops on the ground there. I mean, we know there are already mercenaries, that were troops that have left the armies, and the next day that they're working for a private military company, which is, they're doing the same things, but they're not technically NATO troops. But whatever they're doing, Russia is still slowly advancing, through Bakhmut, through Avdiivka. Now they're about to take Chasov Yar near Bakhmut, and it's not going well for NATO. I mean, do you think this is why that there's increasingly deranged pronouncements from people like Anthony Blinken and Macron and other people like that?
Well, I mean, you have to keep in mind when you say it's not going well, they never really believed Ukraine can defeat Russia. I mean, the math never
Mm,
suggested it. I mean, Russia's 4 times the size of Ukraine. Russia's a nuclear
mm,
superpower. Russia has a vast military industrial complex. So they never
mm,
really thought Ukraine could defeat that. So what were their goals? The goal was to keep the war going and to inflict as many casualties and as much damage on Russia as possible. And at the end, as to I think what are they envisaging now? They're probably thinking in terms of down the road a de facto partition of Ukraine. So
mm,
therefore, some parts of Ukraine will be lost to Russia, but let's say the 75 to 80% of Ukraine that won't come under Russian occupation, that 75 or 80%, they intend to incorporate into NATO. And then they're going to present
mm.
and say, well, yeah, we succeeded. We got the bulk of Ukraine into NATO.
Right.
It's a very dangerous game that they're playing, but I think that's how they envisage it. So I don't think they see it that they're losing.
That actually makes sense the way you put it there, which is something I hadn't thought of before. So I mean that's a really really great insight into what's happening there. But of course the other thing that's happening as well is as well as we got this conflict in Ukraine, now there's a huge conflict in Israel and Gaza, and I think people are absolutely disgusted by that, and that's something you've commented on as well. I mean, what do you think is going to happen in Gaza now with the Iran seeming to be maybe drawn into this conflict imminently?
Well, that's anybody's guess. I mean, I think Iran is a very cautious player and knows that essentially Israel is trying to provoke it to get involved, because if Iran probably suspects that if it does get involved in a war with Israel, that could well suck in the United States. The United States might not just sit
Mm,
on the sidelines if there's a war between Israel and Iran. So Iran is a very, very wary of getting involved in the war with Israel. So Israel did this very provocative act of attacking an Iranian embassy in Syria, and Iran so far hasn't retaliated. It wouldn't surprise me if Iran doesn't really retaliate in any
mm,
symmetrical way, that they don't attack an Israeli embassy, because I think they just don't want to start a war. As for what's going on in Gaza, it's quite horrific, and
mm,
I would imagine Israel will continue as before, and they'll present it as, oh, we have crushed Hamas, but the fundamentals, even if that's true, even if they do destroy the military structure of Hamas, they don't have a plan for what are they going to do in Gaza? How are they going to run it? Who's going to run
mm,
Gaza? There is no alternative government in the wings. And I think Israel doesn't even think that far. I mean, it just simply goes ahead mindlessly, as it's always been doing,
mm.
crushing its opposition. But of course, it never does, because basically you're still going to have 2 million people there who absolutely hate Israel and will want to go on fighting against Israel.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's very clear to me every time they kill an innocent child or an innocent woman in Gaza, or they blow up a hospital, or they blow up a school, or a university, or a church, or a mosque, that's going to create more support for Hamas. Whatever you think of them, that's the reality of the situation. So it's almost, shooting themselves in the foot, really, isn't it? I mean, and
Yeah,
you've got 2 million homeless now.
yeah.
Um, one of the things that they, is being sort of mooted is that these people can then be shipped off to Western Europe, as refugees, which to me would be, equally horrific as destroying their homeland. And then you're saying, well, okay, we know you've now destroyed everything they have, and now you're actually expelling them from the place so they can't rebuild anything. Even if they do take out everyone who was in Hamas on 7th of October. I don't think they will destroy Hamas, because they will continue Hamas by the sort of ethnic cleansing they're doing. I mean, um, do you think that might happen, that they will actually try to expel everyone off to Egypt, or ultimately Europe?
Well, I mean, I think Israel would like to do that. I think like to see it done. However,
Mm,
they haven't succeeded so far. I mean, they had
mm,
that plan um, very early on, but they haven't succeeded because the people in Gaza are not willing to go.
mm,
Egypt is not willing to open the borders. So it's just not a plan that is feasible, and
mm,
and so that's why the idea that somebody else can pick up the slack. Well, maybe the hapless Europeans would be willing to spend enormous amounts of money rehousing
mm,
the refugees from Gaza, but I don't think that plan is going to work, because largely Israel's neighbors know that that's what Israel would like to see done. They would like to see
mm,
yet another massive expulsion.
mm,
I mean, I tend to think that Israel is in the same position as it has always been, because if you go back in recent history, whenever Israel has launched these horrific mass operations, they always build it as, well, this is going to be this final
mm,
settlement, and then from now on, we're gonna be able to move forward, and we'll have economic development, prosperity, and a new civilization growing up in the Middle East. They've always done this. So, well, back in when they invaded Lebanon in 1982, yeah, this is terrible. But once we've crushed the PLO, once that's gone, then there's going to be peace, and everything will be happy. So it's always the same. They've always tried to sell. It did that in 2006 when they fought Hezbollah. Well, once we've done this, then everything's going to be flowering in the Middle East. It never succeeds, and it's not going to succeed this time either.
Right, that's a very good point. I mean, I don't think it will. There's just too many people, and I think there's too much outrage around the world at what they've done. I mean, obviously, what happened on the 7th of October was terrible, but it was very strange that the border, the most securely guarded border in the whole world, was just left unattended at the very moment that Hamas came across and did what they did. So that seems very strange to me. But the outrage of what's happened, and the way that they've engaged in collective punishment, and the horrors that have been meted out on the people of Gaza, I think they've lost a hell of a lot of support. I mean, we don't have too much time until the end of the show, but do you think that Israel's ever going to have that much support again that they've had before this?
No, but Israel can glide by because it has the United States always in its corner. The Biden administration may leak stuff in the media. We're very unhappy what they're doing here. We're unhappy about Rafah. We're unhappy about Netanyahu. But in practical terms, they don't really do anything about it. And now, and Europe is now much more infiltrated by the Israel lobby than it was.
Yeah, I totally agree.
40 years ago.
Indeed, yeah, I do see that as well. Look, George, it has been really, really good and very, very informative for everyone to hear you talk about these things. You're so knowledgeable on this. Thanks so much for coming on the show, and I hope I can talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much, David. Always a pleasure.
Welcome. This is today's News Talk, TNT.